All right. Good evening, everyone. I'm David Uwe, Executive Director of the Chinese American Museum in Washington, D.C., the only museum in the nation's capital dedicated to the Chinese American story. We are so pleased that you can join us this evening for Meet the Author. Jia Lynn Yang, author of One Mighty and Irresistible Tide, the epic struggle over American immigration, is here to talk to us today. Jia is a deputy national editor at the New York Times. She was previously deputy national security editor at the Washington Post, where she was part of a team that won the Pulitzer Prize for coverage of Trump and Russia. Joining us this evening's for this evening's conversation is Ted Gong, a former senior Foreign Service officer. He worked on policies, laws, and operations related to visas, border security, immigration, refugees, citizenship, and consular services. He is the founder and executive director of Our Friends at the 1882 Project Foundation, a nonprofit organization that broadens the public understanding of the history of Chinese in America through a variety of collaborative programs. He is also the recipient of the 2019 Frederick Douglass FD200 Award. And we are joined with Gordon Quan. He's an attorney based in Houston, Texas. Mr. Quan is board certified by the Texas Board of Legal Specialization in Immigration and Naturalization Law. And he served on the board of the American Immigration Lawyer Association. And he was the founding member and chair of the immigration section of the State Bar of Texas. He writes and regularly lectures on immigration law issues. So again, just another housekeeping note. During this event, all attendees can submit questions through the chat or Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. And we'll do our best to answer your questions. And if you'd like to see the panelists all at once, or if you'd like to see them one at a time, you should switch between gallery view and speaker view, I believe. So there's a view selection right at the top of your Zoom window. So welcome everybody. And I guess a good place to start is Jia, tell us a little bit, maybe you could start us off by just telling us a little bit about how you came to focus on this particular subject.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. It's really an honor to be here with all of you, if only virtually, but it's just really an honor to be able to speak with all of you tonight. I came to this book a little bit by accident. I wasn't really setting out to write a book when I started down this journey. Effectively, I was in Austin, Texas for a friend's wedding, and I really have just always loved reading histories of the civil rights movement of America in the 1960s. And if you read anything about that, you know that you can't understand America in the 1960s without understanding Lyndon B. Johnson, the president who was pushing forward so much transformative legislation. So when I was in Austin, just before the flight took off, I looked up where the LBJ Presidential Library and Museum is. And for anyone who hasn't been there, I can't recommend it enough. It's an incredible institution. And so I kind of squeezed in this trip to this museum, and there's a room there that's really powerful because it's effectively all of LBJ's most important legislative achievements. So the laws there are ones that, many of us are taught in school. It's like the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the creation of Medicare and Medicaid, the creation of the Public Broadcasting Corporation, all kinds of things that touch almost every part of American life. And what was surprising to me in this room was a law that I have to confess my total ignorance. I had not really heard of. I may have been taught it, but I had forgotten it, called the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act. And the description of the law said this law was transformative in American history because it helped lead to record numbers of Asian immigrants coming to the US after 1965. And that's when a light bulb went off above my head. And I thought, well, my family came from Taiwan after 1965 in the 70s. Might we somehow be connected to this law? And so I went home and basically began looking and just trying to understand it. It really began as almost like an impulse to learn family genealogy. You know, you learn, like, you can learn who your great grandparents were, but you know, when you're also someone like me or some of you in the audience, like that effort's kind of hard too, because your family has only been here for so long. And so for my family, you know, we had not been here for very long. And so this felt like a really important key to understanding why we were here to begin with, because this is the law that allows for families to have extended members come. And so the more I learned, the more I realized my parents being here, my mom's sister and brother being here. You know, I grew up in Northern Virginia, where I'm sitting right now. They're all in LA, in the San Fernando Valley, their children, like our whole family is here because of this law. And how do I not know enough about it? And so that's what set me down here, a very, very personal reason.
As in your editorial position, have you really taken any particular focus to immigration issues, or did they just come naturally as the news day progressed?
You know, I haven't edited that much immigration coverage. I think my first experience was, I'm trying to think, this was right when I was at the very beginning of my book. I was at the Washington Post, and right after Trump was elected, he had that executive order with the Muslim travel ban. And that was kind of actually the first time I had really been like kind of hit in the face with a big immigration story that I had to handle. You know, occasionally I will dip into it, but it's also an inescapable story. You know, there are people who are explicitly immigration reporters, but anytime someone talks about demographic changes in this country, anytime someone talks about what it means to be American, I mean, these are all issues and ideas and questions that are completely wrapped up in immigration. It's not a thing. I think we sometimes treat it as a thing that you can put in a box to the side next to like healthcare and other, you know, policy issues. But
right.
I think it's so much more tangible than that. It gets at the heart of how we define ourselves and who's even here to begin with. And so these are such fundamental questions that even if the story isn't explicitly about immigration, I find myself thinking about some of the themes that I explored in the book.
Right. You know, one thing I really enjoyed about your book was just how you had an anecdotal approach to each person that you're talking to, so that you really understood whether, regardless of whether you were to see them as a villain or a hero, you know, in the immigration story, to really see where, you know, where their thinking or, you know, where their positions came from. So I would be curious to know, you began by talking about LBJ, but, you know, who do you see as the real unsung heroes of, you know, American immigration?
You know, I shy away a little bit from seeing history through that lens of heroes and villains, because I don't want to be judged through that lens someday either. You know, I think we're all, you know, we have a little of this, little of that in all of us. So,
sure.
But I do think there are people whose roles in shaping our country in its modern form don't get enough credit for just how much they did. And in fact, I think I argue in my book, they themselves had no idea that it would be this transformative. So,
yeah.
And I also, you know, I'll give you an example, and I'll tell you why I thought that adding biographical detail was so important. It's because everyone has some connection to some kind of immigration story, especially if you're writing history that is rooted in, like, you know, the early mid 20th century America. Everybody is like a child of immigrants, themselves an immigrant grandchild. I mean, these are people who are coming in a wave that kind of put this whole idea of a nation of immigrants on the map. So an example, Manny Seller, I would argue, is very much someone who should be far more famous than he is. And he's the grandson of German Jews. And so he's already, you know, his family's already multiple generations in by the time he gets to Congress and plays just a pivotal role in all of this. If your family came from outside Europe after 1965, it is Manny Seller who made that happen. If there was one person who did it. And yet, even though he was born in America, his parents were, he always thought of himself as coming from this Jewish American immigrant family. And that identity is really rooted in why he fought so hard to pass this law. And that's true for a lot of people in the book, right? They have some relationship. The Kennedys are related somehow to their Irish Catholic identity. There are people who are themselves immigrants who turn out to be very anti-immigrant, which we see a lot now too, right? Just because you're an immigrant doesn't mean that you want infinite immigrants to join you in your American journey. And so a lot of primary figures in the book have themselves complex relationships with their identities as, you know, coming from immigrant families. And it's those feelings about that part of their identity that I would argue really gets channeled into their political positions. So you can't really understand this history without knowing the personal family histories of, you know, the people involved in writing these laws.
Yeah, absolutely.
So can we chime in with some questions?
Yeah, of course, Gordon.
I appreciate the fact that you began your study at the LBJ library. I'm a UT graduate, and you know, back in the 60s, we were not so kind toward LBJ during the war in Vietnam and all. And so as his stature has grown over the years, it's amazing as we begin to appreciate all he's done. I was kind of fascinated by the fact that you picked an interesting period, 1924 to 1965. And that was a period of actually little immigration because of the war going on, because of the Great Depression. A lot of people write about 65 because that's kind of a turning point. And they write about 1882 when the Exclusion Act came up. So how did you pick that period per se about the forming of this tide of immigration?
It is a weird period of time because when I looked for histories that have been done, this is partly why I wrote my book, I had trouble finding things that accounted for this period. The first thing to say about this period is that, to me, the top line reason it's so fascinating is it's a period where we explicitly turned away from being a nation of immigrants and being a country that welcomed in immigrants. And that was something I did not, again, I'm pleading all my ignorance here. I'm not gonna hide it from you. I did not realize that. I thought that there was this sort of continuous line, right? Some people came in ships, then some people like my family came in planes landing at JFK airport, you know, uninterrupted stream of people, with exceptions like the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. So like some people were singled out, but by and large, we wanted immigrants, right? From Europe especially. And what I learned is that in 1924, the country passed pretty explicitly, I'd say really white supremacist laws. I mean, that feels like heated language, but these were immigration laws that ranked people by their desirability to become American based on their race and ethnicity, and who put, and these categories basically put at the very tippy top, you know, white Protestant Anglo-Saxons, whatever that term even means, but sort of the WASP, and then on down a pecking order of who the country wanted. And this was explicitly to preserve kind of the white Protestant ethnic identity of the United States. It was a backlash to the number of Jews and Italians who were coming in at the turn of the century. And this law was basically saying, we don't want those people here anymore. We definitely don't want people from Asia, Africa, that we've got to protect this very clear English white identity of America. And so the book is about how after they do this in 24, it takes 40 years to remove these ethnic quotas. Again, explicitly ranking people by race. So what happens is that in this period, there just aren't that many immigrants. You know, the numbers just keep falling and falling and falling to the point where people don't even think of us as having immigrants around because they're just dying off, right? They're the people who came in ships in like 1910, but they're just fewer and fewer of them around. So they're not part of American life, you know, the fabric of our life, the way that we think of immigrants. Of course, they're people who, you know, different restaurants are here even, right? They're just gone. They vanish from the scene. People don't even discuss immigration. The Atlantic Monthly, I was stunned to find in this period, ran like almost no articles about immigration at all. It was just sort of considered a thing of the past. So, I mean, to answer your question, that's why I was interested. I thought, how did we get from saying we don't really want immigrants who aren't this very specific ethnic type to now where we have so many all around us? And this law really is the key to answering that question.
I actually a little bit different from Gordon. I felt like the choice of 1924 and 65 was perfect. They're like bookends to all those immigration issues which we had to debate among ourselves of what our nation was going to be, but which continue today. So as you said, before 1924, except for something like the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is maybe a precursor to some of the laws that are about to come. But it was basically an open immigration system. And the idea that suddenly it changed in the 1920s. And then it stayed that way, despite people like Manny opposing it, a very strong opposition to it. It stayed that way into 1965. Some of the issues that's going, and I'm reading your book, some of the interesting things. Of course, World War I had an impact in the changing of the new arrivals of population. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that from your research. Other things that were happening, the whole society was changing at that time. Jewish immigration, people that coming over from World War II, World War I, and I'd like to get together later, talk to you more about refugees, how that affected our laws. But at the same time, we also had a eugenics movement going on. You had a great section talking about that and how the science of who was better or not better affected immigration. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that came about? And oh, by the way, the 1924 Act was admired by Adolf Hitler as he was building Aryan Germany, right? So can you talk a little bit about that, eugenics, and how the Congress got persuaded into thinking that these type of laws was actually good for the United States?
Yeah, I think sometimes when you look back at our history, it's easy to imagine, I guess to your question, David, of like heroes and villains, I sometimes try to feel more humble about that, because when you read about how things actually happen, you see how easily well-meaning people get sucked into ideas that are really vile, and that it could easily happen to really, we like to think that it wouldn't happen to us, but
misguided people and heroes.
yes, but really with eugenics, it's a great example of this, because it was a science that very much was in line with genetics as we understand it now. It was totally derived from it, and it was a very utopian idea. We're going to perfect humanity by studying different races and ethnicities and deciding how to perfect them, and that some races are inferior to others for these different reasons. And we're just observing, we're just scientists. We're not saying that somebody, but we've seen that so-and-so is more likely to commit a crime. This other person is more likely to have epilepsy or have sort of, mental limitations in their capabilities. So people felt like they were just studying the facts. Of course, when you look at it, it's totally bogus, but it's all dressed up in the scientific method. I mean, I really think we should I think there's a lot of, obviously my mom's a scientist. I respect science very deeply, but there are some very dark lessons to be learned from eugenics about the language of science and how it can be used to paper over really vile ideas. But what's happening is that there's sort of this consensus across intellectual movements in America and in England too at the same time. The eugenics is a really rigorous science, that it's totally legitimate. Economists are involved, environmentalists, progressive activists, again, very utopian. And it sort of melds with the immigration debate, because people are saying, well, they look at the Jews coming and they think something's wrong with them. And then, oh, look, here are scientists proving that they are not fit to be Americans. And so that fusion of kind of racial discrimination plus the language of science really is what powers the legislation in the 1920s that brings about what I was describing earlier of these really, really very very scientific in a way quotas. They're very precise about why certain groups are more desirable than others.
Well, as I was reading your book, and I really enjoyed reading it, I see a lot of the same things resurfacing today that we had before, that there's America for Americans, and there's a certain definition of what is an American. And the same battle back in the 1920s when they were making these laws, we still see today, 100 years later, and we're like, where have we progressed as a nation?
So I think this law is important to talk about for this very reason. I think if you look at the debate around it, I mean, this notion of is there an ethnic definition of what it means to be American, in my mind, remains quite unresolved. And there is, it's hard for people, if you get into that debate with people, the other side of it, of course, is our pluralism is our strength. Our immigrants are our strength. But the law that I think has sent us most in that direction, which is this law that I've written a book about, the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, if you go look at the history, no one explicitly just says it. They keep saying things like, We don't want to discriminate against certain groups. And by that, they mean primarily, the Jews and Italians who were blocked out by the 1920s law. But they say things like, we don't really, people even ask, nativists are like, is this going to let in lots of Asian immigrants? And they say things like, no, don't worry. It's totally symbolic. It's not going to transform the country. It's more or less going to be who's already here. I mean, in fact, the chain migration or family reunification, whatever you want to call it, right? That part of the law that has allowed so many extended families to come was an effort to keep America white. Because they looked around and they said, well, there aren't any non-white immigrants here. So if we let in, your sister and your mother, like there aren't people that we don't want already here. So if we allow extended family, it's going to work out. The math will work out. And in fact, it will reinforce that America is really white. They didn't anticipate that. So when they're writing the law, there isn't really an explicit argument put forth to the nation and to the leaders saying, we are disavowing a white ethnic national identity. We are embracing ethnic pluralism. And I would argue because they didn't do that, they had lots of great intentions, but no one made a full-throated, like, by 2021, people will be talking about a white minority, right? Nobody said that, because I think that if they'd said that, this law wouldn't have passed. So in a way, through like these great principles of equality, I mean, there are at the root of this law extraordinary principles of racial equality, right? It says you cannot discriminate an immigrant trying to get a visa based on their ethnicity. And we're going to disavow these racist quotas from the 20s. That's all exactly, in my mind, totally principled. But when it comes to the actual effects of it and what it means for American identity, I don't think they resolved that. And so we kind of backed into our current demographics, which to me is sort of vulnerable, right? That means that like, it's a little bit hard to protect, because you could argue they didn't intend to do this. We got to take it back, right? It was all a mistake. These people are here, but no more. And you could see in the Trump White House some of that spirit, right? You would hear people like Jeff Sessions talking about these laws and implying that 65 was some grave error and we need to roll it back. So in this history, that kind of unfinished moral business of describing what is America, are we actually going to disavow a white ethnic identity at the root of what this country is? Because I don't think anyone really did that, it's kind of up to the people here now in the country to decide, in a way, like once and for all, maybe not one, it'll never be resolved, but like to renew that effort, perhaps to say like, no, we know the history of the law. We know some of this was unintended, but here's where we're going to take it. And we continue to disavow that older identity.
You know, it's interesting. When I was first picked up your book and I was reading the title, sort of like the One Mighty and Irresistible Tide. And I automatically thought that the irresistible tide was this idea of reinforcing the idea of American being a set of ideas or ideals that we want a diversified country, and that regardless of all these other anti-immigrant laws and these racist laws, this tide is still going to be irresistible and overcome it. But I have to say, after sort of reading your accounts and some of the stories, especially the personal stories, I began to say, well, maybe it wasn't, the irresistible tide was not the 1965 Act. The irresistible tide is the 1924 Act, right? And we're now actually at, maybe it's an ebb in the idea that the 86 reforms or 89 reforms, they're all IRA reforms, they're all immigration. Every immigration law we've ever passed was designed to restrict immigration, except for the 65 Act, right? I don't know, Gordon, you could think about, is that?
But that was
Yeah, but
LBJ's
yeah.
speech,
So,
right? That he gave at the signing of in 1965, right?
yeah, but if you talk to him or you talk to Kennedy or these other guys, they're arguing back, they're lobbying for the law, saying it's not going to really affect immigration or the nature, the structure of the population. So it's exactly what Jia Lynn is saying, is that they weren't thinking about the principle of diversity, which we see as so compelling today in our immigration laws. They were thinking of something else. I'm not exactly sure, but I wonder if that is us also just looking at the various lobbying efforts. I tend to think that that there are persons that are involved in this, like Emmanuel Manny, and they really did believe in something else. And one of the people that I was really impressed with, that I didn't really think of too much about as being involved in immigration law before, was President Truman, and his convictions to take care of displaced persons or take care of the Jews that were displaced by the Holocaust, and then creating all these refugee laws to work around the inability to get rid of the restrictive quotas. Can you talk a little bit about that? I think that that's a story that we don't know too much about. And the more we learn about President Truman, the more he is such an admirable character as well.
Yeah.
He's a really interesting, he's like LBJ again, right? Where there's just this really mixed legacy. Like the minute you're like, oh, he seems like there's something else, like, you know, of course, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you're like, oh my God. So it's like LBJ's Vietnam in my mind. But on refugee law, he is really the force behind why we have refugee laws at all. You know, we take for granted that maybe we do. I did, again, another thing I took for granted, that we have a refugee law and a mechanism for people in this particular political situation to bring them to this country. And this is a direct result of after World War II, when the country has just given so much to save Europe, right, from itself. And then there is this catastrophic refugee crisis. And in Truman's mind, what was the point of this war if at the end of it, we have people living basically in kind of almost like still in kind of camp-like situations. They've been displaced. They don't have anywhere to go back to. Many of them are Jews who've just survived the Holocaust. This is also when the country was beginning to kind of really, the world was beginning to have a clear idea of what the Holocaust actually was and what had been left in its aftermath, because they go to liberate the camps and they see like, oh my goodness, this is what's been going on here. So it's really, the war ends, but this crisis is completely out of control. And it causes Truman to want to support the founding of Israel even. He really wants to find a place for people to go. And for the US's role, he's asking like, how do we take some of these people? And then you look at the immigration laws, it's not possible because, you know, it's been decades since the 20s, but they passed these laws that say, we don't want people from Eastern Europe. We don't want people from Southern Europe. These are the places where there were more displaced people, Jews and others. And so he basically, because of this, these roadblocks, he has to advance refugee laws that we still are very much, you know, molded in. And you know, Gordon knows this better than I do, because you know immigration law. I'm not an immigration lawyer, but the whole idea that you need a sponsor organization, right, like a Lutheran group or one of these groups to sort of take you in, that's completely from the 1948 Refugee Act. So all of that law evolves under the kind of strict conditions of these quotas that make it so hard, which is why people have to start doing this. It's why there are all these efforts to bring in people from the Cold War. You know, there are all these carve-outs that presidents do. They're always trying to kind of weave and dodge around this basic, very limited structure for immigration. And Truman very much pioneers a lot of it because he feels so urgently that we should be rescuing refugees.
Yeah, and it's had such an impact on us, Gordon, in our business.
No, really, because when they repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act, what the quota was 105. I mean, virtually nothing. If it wasn't for refugees, Chinese would not be here. They came as refugees from China because China had been torn because of the Civil War there. But that really propelled our population to come, not the 52 Act, which began recognizing China as having a quota. So
yeah, I mean, I really look at 1965 as the true end of the Chinese Exclusion Act, because, you know, I always think of that 105 number, and I always envision a small theater full of 105 people, and you think about for the entire country how few people that really is. It was really just such an empty gesture, really.
And to tell you just how much it was focused on ethnicity, right? And Ted, correct me if I'm wrong, it was 105 people of Chinese descent. So you could be from England or France or wherever, and you still count as Chinese, because again, they don't care so much about your country of origin so much as what is your race? We got to know, right? Like we can't have 105 people from China and then, you know, 500 people of Chinese descent from England. That ruins the whole scheme.
Right.
Yeah, even that was so small.
Here's something cool, David. we have 100 participants. So all of us were listening. That's the entire,
participants.
that's the entire
right.
group.
That's the quota right there.
But
Yeah,
you,
you're
but
right.
you know, it was not just the 65 Act, definitely in our 1882 foundation, when we talk about it, 65 is the act that we say really ended the racist provisions of 1882. But there's a huge number of people that come in. It's like Gordon's saying, we process these refugee programs. When I was in Hong Kong, we were processing refugee programs out of immigration for the international migration, European migration program. We were taking people out of Shanghai. But the important act and the other exceptions that we don't think about, which is also trying to get around the rules, was the 1945 the War Rights Act. My mother and almost all these families get around the act, the limitations by going through these exceptions. This is not an executive order, but it's close to that kind of processing, right? So those things still continue and have an impact in the way we do things. In fact, I would argue that the 45 Act and some of the refugee acts are some of the precursors to the accepted category, in the Immigration Act, that doesn't count against quota, the wives of the citizens and mothers and fathers of the citizens. And what that does then is sets up things like chain migration.
Exactly. Yeah, they keep trying to avoid the quotas. So a lot of these, you know, like the Cubans who come in, right? LBJ, the same day he signs this law, he's like, and the Cubans can come, and it's limitless. There's no. A lot of these people it's out of the quotas. So yes, when they write the law, they forget that over time they've admitted so many people in these carve-outs. And I would also say one thing that surprised me during the book is how much this is driven by foreign policy in the Cold War. I mean, people used to imagine our immigration law as an extension and very powerful tool in our foreign policy. So the immigration law is meant to advance foreign policy goals because it seems foreign maybe to our ears now, but people think of the way you treat immigrants from a certain country is deeply embedded in your relationship to that country. So one of the other weird wrinkles about this period is that this whole period in which immigration is very restricted from around the world, there is no restriction for Western Hemisphere. So Latin and South America, totally unlimited. And I think the core reason for that was these are our neighbors. You know, we have to have good relations with them. We can't antagonize them with a law that says you're racially inferior, because that's not a good way to manage your foreign policy. So all of this, presidents, when they look at it, when they see the law, it's not necessarily, you know, people like Manny Seller, I do think on principle just felt like this is the right thing to do, but people like, you know, Kennedy too, there was principle, but there was also, this is part of fighting the Cold War. And it's also why they abolished the quotas too, because they look at it and they say, these are actually so racially discriminatory. We can't lecture the Soviet Union about democracy and principles if our immigration laws are this bad. So, you know, in all kinds of ways, people looked at it through the lens of what is our place in the world, right? Whereas now we think of it as such a domestic nativist thing. You know, can we take more immigrants? Before it was much more that plus what does that mean about our standing in the world and all our relationships with allies?
Well, one of the things I think I was surprised you did not write about to an extent is the Chinese confession program. Because that also opened the door for many people, because as you know, with the Exclusion Act, so many people were paper sons and claimed different relationships. And it was part of that anti-communist feeling that we need to know who these Chinese are. We need to know their real names. We need to know who their brothers and sisters are. And so that period really opened the door also for a number of brothers and sisters and relatives who otherwise were not being included because we didn't know who they really were at that point in time. So it's kind of, to an extent, a dark period because it brought out all the lies the Chinese have been making all this time. But by the same token, it developed more relationships that could clarify who's who and bring more people in.
But you know,
I took off my light because it was flickering, but go on, Ted.
I was going to say, you know, the confession program and the anti-communist party, also at this period, we begin to get into the McCarthy period. And you have a good section about that, talking about about how that impacted people's perceptions of what the law should be. This whole anti-communism thing was a real fear for a lot of people. And so we talk about the good guys like Seller, but there are also those other guys, right? Like who seem to be very convicted about the security of the United States. And those arguments still continue today, that the reason we have immigration laws to prevent the terrorists out or this sort of stuff. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the motivations of the people you study who are on the other side, like the senator from Nevada, McCarran, right? And then there was also the guy from Ohio. You know, these guys were opposed to the elimination of the national quotas, almost to a personal obsession. And yet, if you look at Nevada, I mean, how many immigrants actually affected his state, right? Except that Gordon and I know that there's exceptions for sheep herders in the immigration laws, and that was something somebody in Nevada wanted. But can you talk a little bit, what is motivating these people? We know that Manny Seller is coming from a Jewish background, and this Jewish diaspora and so forth issues are there. But what is compelling guys like McCarran and so forth to be so opposed? They just totally oppose. So they block everything until you get somebody like LBJ that just runs them over, right?
Yeah, I actually really wanted to understand them because, again, it's easy to say, oh, those people were just, you know, they were racist, they were nuts, they didn't understand. And like, and I wanted to humanize even them to kind of get at what's going on. I mean, somebody like McCarran is even weirder. So Pat McCarran is a senator from Nevada who's very powerful. Again, one of these people who used to have tons of power that we don't talk about anymore. But if you ever fly into Las Vegas, the airport is named after Pat McCarran. So if you've encountered that, that's one way you may have come across him. But he's very powerful in the Senate for many, many years. He himself is the son of Irish Catholic immigrants. So again, it's like he's connected to the immigrant story. And there are other people like him, again, in the book who are nativists, but very, you know, themselves immigrants. Maybe like they're from Wales or anyway. So I think for him and for some of these people, at the risk of psychoanalyzing a little bit, I think sometimes what happens is that they see how hard it is to be an immigrant, right? And it makes them, they really, their patriotism and this idea of like, I'm now really American, right? I have to assert, I worked so hard to fit in. My family was really poor. I mean, Pat McCarran grew up on a sheep herding farm, barely was, you know, could get an education. He had to ride a horse for miles and miles to get to the nearest tiny schoolhouse. He's not someone who comes from remotely any money. And yet he develops this very strong sense of patriotism and about what America really is about. And you see this sometimes with these nativists, especially the ones who are immigrants or the children of immigrants. They feel this deep sense of possessiveness, I think, of what American identity is. And it leads them to view with great suspicion people who will dilute that Americanness in their minds. So for someone like McCarran, this gets channeled into just rabid anti-communism and McCarthyist tactics. I mean, he is obsessed with defeating communism so much that he gets sort of excited about hanging out with Franco in Spain because Franco defeated the communists, and he thinks, well, your enemies are the communists, so are mine. And he's obsessed with the idea that communists are going to infiltrate the country and destroy it from within. And I wonder how much of that is about, this is my country now, you know, like we came from Ireland, we made it ours, and now we have to protect it at all costs. And also, I think we also have to remember, I mean, why would an immigrant from Ireland feel any solidarity or connection to an immigrant from some other country? I mean, we shouldn't assume that just because you're an immigrant, you identify automatically with other immigrants from totally different places. I mean, Pat McCarran certainly didn't feel that way. He saw potential spies everywhere. So I don't know. I think there is something going on there. And I think it's worth exploring in our current times too, when there are immigrants who are not, you know, we saw this, a lot of immigrants voted for Trump, you know, 4 years of a very nativist platform did not turn them off, because I suspect for many of them, you know, they thought like, I agree to some degree. It's okay for me to be here, but those are the different immigrants, and I don't want those people there. So there's a lot. I don't mean to like, I don't know that I endorse this myself, but I do think there is a lot to kind of explore and to understand and not just condemn, because it's still with us today. And it's about thinking about like, what is, what would it take to build a coalition to change our immigration system and to include buy-in from immigrants? Because you cannot, if you want that, you cannot take for granted that you're going to have their support.
Yeah.
Do you think that to some extent, whether it's because fear of socialism or communism or fear of jobs being lost, or it's just it was more of a eugenics argument, or is it just a cycle that keeps happening, or do you think that we're starting to come to back to a straight line where these extreme points of view are becoming fewer, maybe more vocal, but fewer?
It's hard to say. I mean, I was struck, there were polls toward the end of the Trump presidency that showed that there was more support for more immigrants coming in compared to people who said, I want fewer or the same, than ever that they had done this poll.
Yeah.
I think it was Gallup. It's been many decades. I used actually these polls in my book. They've been doing it for a long time. And I think that was, honestly, I don't know that was just like greater love for immigrants. I think that was kind of a partisan reaction to Trump, right? Trump stood for being anti-immigrant. So if you were anti-Trump, you were so anti-Trump that you were pro-immigration, which is like not historically consistent. So I don't know. I mean, I think people have lots of reasons for this. I do think when the economy is not great, right? Like I think President Biden is in this weird situation. The economy is not great. He also wants to overhaul immigration laws. Politically, that doesn't feel like the best setup to me, right? Like, I don't think, people who study this have said we shouldn't view immigrants as, total like job loss, but there is a sense of which, people feel like they're undercut by immigrants for labor. I mean, there's all these associations with immigrants as being a threat to a person's job. I don't think those necessarily go away. And I don't know that people who think that, I just think you're more likely to be skeptical, right, if the economy is not good.
So if you were to reach into your back pocket and pull out the young immigration reform policy, what might that look like based on what you've learned from writing this book? Not necessarily specifically the policies, but how to approach it in a way that could help move things forward.
I mean, I don't actually know. I think it's so hard, and I actually don't feel like it's up to one expert or historian to say, because the questions we're talking about who, first of all, we have to ask ourselves, do we want open borders? Because that was historically what we did. I mean, that's the other thing about the book I learned is that about 100 years ago, open borders. There was this like literacy test from 1917, didn't really stop that many people. Really just if you could make the journey, you were in. We didn't have visas. We barely had passports. Like they're just all this paperwork that we've built up over the last 100 years didn't exist. So I would say the baseline for that kind of conversation as a democracy is, do we want open borders? If you don't want open borders, which politically, right, that seems impossible. Well, how many people is too many? What's the number? So it's not limitless. There's some limit.
Yeah.
How do you get to that number? Okay.
And it's not based on a particular people, but maybe how much can the country handle at a given time?
Whatever that means.
What
right?
helps GDP or
yeah, or like I don't know. You can print lots of money from the Fed. Like and we're the wealthiest country in the world still, despite the last year. Like we're still. So what would the limit be? And I don't know the answer to that, but I think you have to kind of go through these steps first, honestly, because otherwise the whole framework in my mind doesn't really hang together. So it's like, okay, open borders or not, how many people can you take? Now you get to even the harder part. So who are you going to take? You've agreed upon a number. Who is more worthy? If you have limited slots, who are you bringing in? Are they, political dissidents who are going to get killed if they don't have safe harbor, in this country? Is it the person who has an advanced science degree for some job or skill that our country badly lacks for whatever reason? Is it people whose every sibling of mine already lives in the US, let me come too? I mean, there are all these potential kind of moral, economic, social arguments for any number of people. So how do we decide how to, who to admit and who not to? And I basically just try to say, I don't feel like first of all, I don't know how to answer these questions. I looked at the history. I don't really know what that is. And I would be suspicious I am suspicious of anyone who says I have the answer, right? There's a math way to work it out, because I think these questions are all moral, philosophical ones.
I agree with that, but I think that they're trying to sell it basically on what's in it for us as Americans, what is in it for the country. So if you look at what's been proposed, it's like, let's see, who does have these skills? How do we parcel out visas to economic undeveloped areas of the country to let them boost because of immigrants being entrepreneurs? So I think that they're trying to say, look, they're not bad people. They're actually giving to our country. If we're going to be in this race with China and other countries, we need these people in the science areas and different areas. And so that to me is the sales pitch. If you look at what Biden is saying, and of course, we all saw that yesterday he signed that proclamation dealing with xenophobia toward Asian Americans, and that he's going to put a task force on that. So, I see him taking a bold move with this new immigration bill. And I think that the immigrant community has been hanging around saying, have some guts, do something. We're tired. We tried in 2008 with Bush. We tried in 2013 with Obama. We've never gotten anywhere. You guys have said you're going to be fighting for us. If he doesn't do it within these 2 years, the midterms, the Democrats may be out.
I mean, that's the whole thing too, is that you need that. The lesson for the book is there's 40 years of really solid arguments, both sides, right? The guy what is patriotism, what is American, and they have all these arguments going back and forth, and they continue today. But it takes, and we know this, Gordon. When we do immigration reform, they debate, and then at the last minute, almost nothing gets done. And in the middle of the night, somebody does something, and it happens, right? That's what happened in the 86. That's what happened in 89. so, and that's what we were expecting in 2007. But some of the things, and one of the interesting things I've seen, and we've been doing this for a while, is that people don't talk to each other anymore. Some of the best ideas that Democrats could have accepted, like DACA. DACA was actually a Republican proposal in the original form, but now they don't even talk to each other, about it. They won't raise those issues. So you need something really bold. And one of the great things I think that is coming out is the question is maybe not how many people you bring into America, but how many people you get engaged into the process. So one of the things you mentioned is that until the 65 law, which was we say is a great law, you didn't have a Western Hemisphere limitation. So Mexicans could come and go, and this circular migration was really a pattern there. But then once the law is there, we create this huge illegal undocumented process. And each time the law was tightened up, you created more people who stayed on this side of the border and more reason to come back. So maybe is what Biden's proposed, which has also appeared in some of the old Kennedy present things. The markups on there was to provide more foreign aid to those sending countries. So you address those issues more. So one of I think is the more the recent proposal by Biden. Actually, we should emphasize: don't spend money on the wall. Spend money and figure out how do you help these guys and move industries that are shared. So the key issue to me is not even immigration law, it's the North Atlantic Treaty laws and the trade laws and things of this. How do you facilitate trade to integrate the workers and the people actually? So we may be even asking the wrong questions by saying, who should be allowed to come into in the United States?
Yeah, and I thought Julian Castro in his Democratic primary run had that kind of plan, right? It was almost like, I think he referenced like the Marshall Project, right? It was very like, this is a comprehensive, we're not just going to look at like the wall and the border, we're looking at this whole relationship with Latin America.
That's right. That's right.
And I think, and I was, no one else seemed to have anything quite so ambitious. But I thought that was provocative.
But Gordon, if you look at the border economy, Mexican border economy, and the amount of people that go in and out of them in these places, there may be better lessons to learn from there than how do you deport or do interior enforcement, right?
No, I mean, I always find it interesting. The Walmart in McAllen is the biggest Walmart they have because of the trade from Mexico coming in. And those economies thrive on each other. And the twin plants and everything in that area has really helped both sides of the border. So a lot of people don't look at the economic aspect. I mean, Mexico is our biggest trade partner. So, you know, nobody looks at some of those things. So I think you're right. I think you're on a good point.
You know, as we're coming near to the end, and there may be some other questions, but I did wanted to think about some of the other issues. Actually, I wanted to get into what was the melting pot. I think there's a difference between when it was originally proposed and the way Theodore Roosevelt thought of it and what we thought of it today. But anyway, aside from that, as we come to close, I had this, and this topic sort of runs them together. I was very interested in your last sentences of your book. And I wanted to really get you in to talk a little bit more of that. And let me quote you, okay? So the episode, you say, as we're talking about becoming American or becoming an immigrant in the United States, you say, not one of us deserves to be here. So what difference is there between us with our precious papers and the people we see at our border who are dying to come in? There is none. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
It's supposed to be the last word, but for you, I will do an epilogue. So it was kind of my that was the only conclusion I could come to after spending 4 years looking at the history. We've built up so many legal categories for people. I mean, how many different kinds of visas do we have? You have these documents, you have those documents, you're legal, you're not illegal. Oh, today you're legal, or you're kind of legal, you're provisionally legal. And so I think we've actually lost sight of that we're all human beings, right? Like whether you want this person here or not, the idea that there's kind of a pecking order of people based on these legal statuses. I felt like when you look at the history and you see where they come from, it strips them away. And you see that, you know, the difference between me being, first of all, it really humbles you that your family's even here, because you could just as easily, I think if you read this book and you see how many times this law in 1965 could have easily not happened, I feel every day that my presence here, my existence here and my family's presence is a total historic fluke and contingency. And so as a result, I can't sort of sit high and mighty in my chair and say, well, I'm legal, those people are illegal, because if I just trace it back, it's I mean, not completely arbitrary, but pretty arbitrary, like that we got to be here, right? What's the difference between my Chinese family and the Chinese family that tried to come in like 1948? What's the difference? Who didn't make the 105 quota cut? We're not more worthy of those people. These are laws that the US passes for all these different reasons. Some of them, you know, feel sort of directed in a certain way. Some of them feel pretty arbitrary, but the result of these laws is then the laws decide who gets to come and who doesn't. That is not the same as, in my mind, a value judgment about the worthiness of a human being. You can decide that you don't want that person here for these reasons because you want somebody else instead, or you can't take in that many, but I don't think you get to conclude that just because the law says that person can't be legal, that person is somehow less than. And I think if you look at World War II, I mean, one thing that haunted me as I wrote my book, that continues to haunt me today, these are papers that can all be changed and taken away. If you look at what happened to German Jews, for instance, right? One day they're citizens. The next day, the same political system that gave them citizenship said, you are no longer a citizen. And people became stateless. So what is the value of my paper? My papers are only the result of the political system we have and political will. Somebody, if you can build enough support, can say, you know, I was born in 1982. They can say, if you have birthright citizenship and you were born after 1980, those papers are null and void now. I don't think anyone's doing that tomorrow, but that's what my papers are worth. So that's what I'm trying to say. Like, after learning all of this, I just became very humbled about my status. I mean, I don't stay awake at night worrying if someone will take them away, but I do now see them as just pieces of paper. They're not actually conferring some inherent value in me or my family. They're just papers that we were lucky enough to get when other people haven't gotten them.
Yeah.
We have a lot of other questions here, but real quickly, I saw that only one Asian American was cited for this advocacy, Mike Masasoda. Were there other Asians who fought for this? I mean, it seems like, was the battle by others and we were just, you know, lucky beneficiaries?
You know, there's some, like you can see in the archives when I was going through, you would see some Asian advocacy groups getting involved when there were these big debate flashpoints in 1952 and 1965. But really, the thing to know is that there weren't that many Asians here. So there wasn't a lot of political force behind it. Like, it was really, the heart of this was actually Jewish American lawmakers and groups who just had more political power, right? This is the New Deal coalition of FDR. They're becoming the heart of the Democratic Party. Like, these are the people that are really out there in force advocating, and they have elected officials and they have that sort of say. And Mike Masaoka, I'd argue, only has the say because there's this really elaborate effort after the internment camps to fight in the war and die for the country. And so it's because of that enormous sacrifice that these Japanese American activists have such standing in Congress, which again is not used to seeing anyone Asian in the halls of power, to argue for any kind of, you know, change in the immigration laws. So, I mean, look, this is just one book of history. I focused on the legislative activity. There were not Asian American lawmakers. There are now. So there may have been other activity, but when you look at, and my argument is, if you look at the core reasons why the law is passed, it's unmistakably these figures.
Well, I hate to say we're out of time. So tomorrow night, everyone tune in to part 2. I'm just kidding. But
we do have part 2, David. We
What's
have a talk story at.
That's right.
Yeah, we have a talk story in the Angel Island Immigration Station on May 7.
Yeah, I will put up.
I'll
put up the 1882 website.
February 7, and I will be talking about the Angel Island Immigration Station and its history and some of the issues they faced there.
I will put up Ted's website in a moment. Hold on a second. So, Jia, your book is available at several places online, but I think if you go to your website, right, then you can probably get a link to where you can get the book.
Yes. And I would love if anyone is interested in the book and you have a beloved local bookstore that you want to support, I fully endorse you going there first.
Terrific. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I think everyone else will too. So here are a few websites. If you would like to learn more about Ted's organization, the 1882 Foundation, which is also a sister organization of the Chinese American Museum, go to 1882foundation.org. And if you'd like to check out Gordon's law firm, it is quanlaw.com. So, well, I really thank you. Thank everybody for joining us today. And thank you to our panelists. And Jia, we're looking forward to your next book. What's your next project that you're working on?
I just had a daughter about a year ago. That's like all the book time just went right over to a toddler.
Okay, so a parenting book.
But hopefully, I would love to do it again. It's an extraordinary experience to actually explore political history through this lens and get to go into libraries like the LBJ library and go through stuff myself. So I would love to do it again. But it was really an honor to be here with all of you tonight. It was a great discussion. So thank you, Gordon and Ted and David, for having me.
Thank you.
All right.
All right. Well, everybody have a great evening and have a safe ride home. Oh, you're already home. All right. Take care. Good night.